In this video, we'll be taking a look at our evolving relationships with plants and animals. To do this, I've created a timeline of important milestones and discoveries. We'll start the timeline approximately 1.5 million years ago, when fire can be made and used for keeping warm, cooking, and fending off predators. Cooking helps to make food softer, and this is said to have allowed us to have evolved smaller jaws and teeth. At the same time, bone, stone, and wood tools are being used for cutting, pounding, and grinding things. These new tools would have been used for hunting, food preparation, and protection against other rival tribes and animals. The next milestone starts 8 to 10,000 years ago, and it's known as the Neolithic Revolution. This is when people made the transition from being a nomadic people to agricultural communities. Nomadic people wandered from place to place looking for food, usually leaving to go to warmer places in the winter or when the food supply was exhausted. They had to travel light as they moved from one place to the next. The transition to agricultural communities meant settling down in one place, and for this to happen, a year-round supply of food and water was needed. It also required the building of better shelters to withstand the harsh winters. Animal and vegetable cropping needed to be mastered, and the main crops grown at this time, depending on the climate, were wheat, barley, millet, sorghum, rice, legumes, and things like that. Villages were soon formed and grew into larger communities as more people arrived for the better lifestyle they offered. The ancient civilization 6000 BC to 2000 BC follows on, and we begin to see the early forms of concrete used with mud for buildings. Concrete would be further developed by the Egyptians and Romans and used for much bigger projects like aqueducts. This is also the time of the invention of the wheel. Wheels started to be used in carts to transport heavy goods and grain foods. Better techniques are starting to develop in agriculture. Simple irrigation by digging trenches to allow water to flow from nearby rivers. This allowed crops to survive droughts. Ploughing started to be used to aerate the soil to improve drainage and remove the weeds. We now move on to the Metal Age, which starts with bronze. Bronze is formed by melting and combining two metals, copper and tin. Having metal tools means that crops like wheat can be cut easier. Bronze was also used for pipes and fittings to improve irrigation and water transfer. The Iron Age in 1200 BC used iron, and this metal was more durable and suitable for things like spades, rakes, and plows. This is also the time of our first writing systems, which allowed history, knowledge, and methods of doing things to be recorded for future generations. In the classical era 400 BC to 400 AD, we see the rise of the Greek and Roman empires. Growing food and crops well is becoming essential to keep communities fed, and when crops fail, it is a major setback. Growing the same crop every year in the same place depletes the soil of nutrients and minerals. And the same practice can also lead to a build-up of insect pests and diseases. To address this problem, the two-field crop rotation system was introduced. The system allowed for two fields, one field where nothing was grown and allowed to rest, while the other field was planted and cropped. The fields the following season were reversed. Additionally, various methods were discovered to enhance the soil by the addition of animal manures and composts. The Romans perfected the art of making concrete. This led to amazing engineering feats like the construction of aqueducts that allowed for water transportation over great distances. Improved roads allowed more goods to be transported, and trading routes were established. The towns became cities as the population grew, and more complex political systems were needed to maintain law and order. In this era, we see the first introduction of pleasure gardens, which are not just about vegetable and herb growing. Two styles emerged. In the West, we had the Roman pleasure gardens, featuring formal, geometric layouts based on a grid system. Plants were clipped into hedges and shapes. Water features, including ponds and fountains, were incorporated. In the East, the Chinese pleasure gardens embraced natural ponds and informal planting in an effort to reflect natural landscapes. Both styles required regular maintenance and were symbols of wealth and power. The purpose of these new gardens was to impress and entertain visitors, while also providing places of relaxation. After the Roman Empire fell, we've got a medieval time from 900 AD to 1200 AD. This is sometimes called the Dark Ages, and it certainly was pretty dark in Europe at that time because things like castles were built and moats around the castle, and you had internalized gardens, so you had to protect your crops. There were still crops out in the villages though, and they started to use a thing called the 3-field crop rotation, where they had wheat, barley in one field, they'd have legumes, which were the nitrogen ones, that the peas and beans that would help for the nitrogen, and then the third field would be bare, and then they would alternate between the fields. We've got the start of the spread of plants. So you remember this is a time where you've got things like the Crusades happening. So people going in the armies across to different places or just traveling, and they're seeing different things, different plants, and they say, "Oh, that looks good. We'll have some of that," and they bring it back to their own countries, and things like cotton, sugar, citrus and rice. Think of cotton now. This is a time where people are getting sort of, cotton clothes. Before that, you'd be having clothes made out of flax or bird feathers or animal skins. That's what they would have had. So moving on, we've got early modern era. This is 1400 AD to 1700 AD. This is kind of what you sort of almost like the renaissance of the world at the moment, especially in Europe. And we've got the spread of plants, potatoes, maize and tomatoes. People like Sir Walter Raleigh were going out and going to different countries in Asia and over to the Americas and picking up these things and taking them back. We've got new machinery to provide a seed drill. So a seed drill is where it can make a small furrow in the soil, a little tiny trench where the seed goes. And of course, seeds do better if they're buried by the soil a little bit. In the garden design world, we're looking at 985 AD. We've got Sanzan garden. This is a very natural, irregular shaped garden with water, waterfalls, that sort of thing. And then later on in Europe, we're getting still the formal gardens. So we've got Villa d'Este, 1550, waterfalls, massive engineering, displays of wealth, and just a real advancement in design. This is the Renaissance. Moving on that, we've moved into the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s to 1900s. We've got modern plant classifications. So up to this point, there's been attempts at classifying plants as they've seen them. Early on, it was medicinal plants, and they'd have common names for it, and then they were getting more developed in those classifications. But now we've got almost the sort of system we use today. This is developed by Carl Linnaeus on taxonomy. We've got the binomial system, where you classify a plant with its genus and its species, and he puts out big encyclopedias of different plants, classified by their sexual flowering parts. We've got the start of the synthetic fertilizers, ammonium sulfate and superphosphate. This is the time where we've got factories and people going into factories and producing things on a great scale. We've got sanitation happening. We've got a better supply of water and everything else to keep cities and people alive, basically. We've got pesticides, nicotine and arsenic, very poisonous. But these are the early attempts to kill the bugs. And we've got high yield crops. So up to this point, there's been a lot of diversity of crops. There's been crossbreeding of different plants to get better plants, but it's really taking off now. You've got things like the Granny Smith coming out, where you're crossing two different types of plants. Moving on from there, we've got things like the modern era. And this is where we get real mechanization happening, the start of the use of the fossil fuels to create engines and things that can really save on labour and do things that people can't do. So we've got tractors. Great, it's a great advancement for farming. Stepping down from there, we've got fertilizer. These are the proper nitrogen fertilizers. Plants want a lot of nitrogen to grow. This is what turns them green. This is their major element they need. Nitrogen is basically used to create proteins for growth and in the plants. And so ammonium nitrate, urea, It's a big greening part. And of course, now they're thinking, actually, well, we don't really need the crop rotation so much because we're getting these artificial fertilizers. Of course, later on, that they will start to think about sustainability issues with regarding fertilizers of over-fertilizing. But at this stage, it's a big advancement. We've got much better pesticides now. We've got the use of DDT, again, great at the time. Now it's banned because it is actually a very toxic chemical, as in it stays in our system. Once it goes into the soil, it stays in the soil. Bugs eat it, then they die. And if a bird eats the bug, that bird dies. If something eats the bird, then that dies. So that's why they banned it. So, but it is actually still used today in certain countries. So we've got organophosphates and cambates. These are things, organophosphates are things like malathion, used to kill insects. Cambates are things like carbaryl, which is used to kill caterpillars. Selective breeding, hybridization programs, grafting, all this sort of stuff is really sort of taking off now, and you're getting a lot more control of the fruit and the vegetables and the crops. We've got biological control happening with biopesticides and natural predators, things like introducing wasps, parasitic wasps, and sometimes the bacteria that can be sprayed onto plants to kill caterpillars. This is the start of also right at the end of the 1900s. We've got genetic modification happening of organisms, GMO, and the first plant to be GMO'd, I believe, is tobacco in 1983, and this is where they made it disease resistant by putting in a bacteria. Moving on now to our modern time, 2000s, we've got precision agriculture, we've got GPS, drones and sensors. It's really taking off. We're really understanding what's happening in our environment much more, and therefore we're looking at sustainability issues, things about biodiversity and impact of taking away forests, impact of too much housing happening with floods and drainage issues. Hydroponics and vertical gardens are taking off also. This is getting rid of soil completely and using liquids and solutions and growing things in vertical arrangements to save on space. We also are getting better with GMO editing and modification, including things like making fruit last longer. So Arctic apple was developed, making potatoes disease resistant to the potato blight. And potato blight was the big one that wiped out a huge amount of the Irish. About 1 million people died in Ireland during the potato famine. And it was a disaster because of potato blight. Now they've got a innate potato that's resistant to the blight. Golden rice. So in Asia, there's a vitamin A deficiency, and this causes children to go blind. About approximately 500,000 children go blind of it if they don't get enough vitamin A. So they genetically modified rice to be golden. Rice is normally white, but they made this one golden and introduced a bit of carotene in there, a bit of vitamin A, and now that is not so much of a problem. They went on to climate resilience, so flood-resistant rice. So they found that rice, if it got submerged underwater for too long, more than 3 days, it would die. Therefore, they introduced a rice product that was much more resistant to the new rice varieties, and then they got rice that could survive 21 to 23 days underwater. They've also got climate-resilient, drought-resistant corn now. Now, I'll also quickly mention that along with all the GMO, we've got GMO Roundup-ready crops. These are quite controversial because now we are increasing in the amount of pesticides, herbicides used, which also has an effect on the soil, something to bear with. And of course, there's Roundup that now is used for desiccating crops like wheat and corn and things like that. It dries them off and dries the seed off to crop. So these are where you actually are going to have to look at sustainability and their health impacts on the human population. Okay, guys, we've come to the sort of beginning and end. I'll just sort of say quickly. So we've got hit code in England is 1922. That was really sort of like a boosting up in flowers, and we also have modern gardens with a modern approach to landscape design. Okay, guys, we'll leave it there. We'll see you in the next video.